Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something on the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow if you're watching or listening. Also, if you or someone you know like to come on the show and have a chat with me, feel free to reach out to me on whatever social media platform you're on because I'm there too. And if you go to isaac.r11.com, you'll see links to all the different places. With that out of the way, let's just get started. My guest today, we're having a very wide-ranging conversation about a bunch of different stuff before we got started, and I'm looking forward to continuing that conversation and maybe learn something a bit new. So my guest today is William Morgan. William, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Howdy. Hi, everyone. My name is William Morgan. I am the CEO of a company called Buoyant, and we are most known for an open source project called Linkerd, which is in the Kubernetes.
Never heard of it at all. Linkerd.
Yeah,
Never,
yeah,
never heard of
obscure.
it. Yeah. I think we're going to talk about all of the things around cloud native and Kubernetes and orchestration and sidecars and all those sort of things in a bit. I
And
want to
AI. Don't
And,
forget
well,
AI.
well,
Gotta
sure,
work
of
that in
course. I
there.
mean, we have to talk about AI, but I like to get started at the beginning. So, for you, when was the first time that technology introduced itself to you, and when did you realize that it was the thing that you wanted to kind of be attached to for the rest of your professional career?
Gosh, yeah. So I'm an old man, Isaac, and I got I got started in the days of DOS, and I just remember for whatever reason, and this was kind of maybe a year or two prior to high school. I had there's a big period in my life prior to that where I was like, I don't, I knew there were these other kids who were like really into computers, and I was like,
Sure,
that's weird. Why would you be so into that thing? And then at some point I was like, oh my gosh, this is really fascinating. And I kind of begged, borrowed, and stole my way to owning a personal computer with MS-DOS 3.1 on it, and I quickly started spending all of my time editing, autoexec.bat and loading TSRs and all of that good stuff. And I think that kind of set the tone of everything going forward. A couple of years later, when I was in high school again, this is really dating myself. It was early days of Linux, and I was fortunate enough to have a whole bunch of. If you think I'm nerdy, you should have seen the friends I was hanging out with back then. We were passing around lunch bags full of not drugs, which maybe would have been healthier, but full of 3.5-inch floppies with Slackware. It's
yeah,
like 35 floppies to get the thing. And then, at that point, we were like, all right, yeah, we're taking down Microsoft. Now we're like, we're sticking it to the man. We don't want to buy Windows 95. We're gonna run Linux instead. And
sure.
that was yeah, a lot of stuff happened after that. But yeah, that was the start for me.
Yeah. Let me ask this question. And I have some history in this space too that I always like to tell this story. But so, when did you realize that you're talking about like a very specific kind of individual like chooses Linux over Windows or chooses Linux over Mac, right? You know, what do you think that characteristic is? Because I've met a ton of people that
Mhm.
they'll buy a laptop at the store and they'll literally take it home and they'll wipe the hard drive and put Ubuntu on it, or they'll put Solaris on it or whatever, right? Um,
Yeah.
so like, what is the genetic disposition of somebody that chooses Linux over all the other things?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the answer there has changed over time. And the answer for me certainly has changed. Like, I was that person hardcore, for a lot of my life. And then the past decade, I've been like, you know what, I'm gonna run the bones Mac, and I'm not gonna configure it.
Yeah,
And like, I'm gonna treat it as a disposable object, and then I'm gonna throw it when it's done, I'm gonna throw it away and buy a new one. Well, not really.
yeah, sure,
But I think so. It's funny because I do, a lot of what I do is interface with the open source community in Kubernetes and the CNCF, and like we should definitely talk about that at some point because the way that open source community works is quite different from like my introduction
sure.
to open source, which again was like Linux in the 90s on with the Slackware. But at that point, I think there were two things that were going on for me. And again, I was a high school student, so like, you not fully developed
Sure.
prefrontal cortex,
I remember
etc.
myself at 16. I understand what you're trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, instead of like smoking behind the dumpster or like riding motorcycles or whatever, I was like installing this thing. But for me, part of it was, I literally did not want to pay money for
Yeah.
like
Sure.
Windows. I was like, why would I do this? Part of it was, I think, just wanting to like configure everything that could be configured, and I think that's a big part of it that remains today. Part of it was, I think, was just feeling at that point, it felt like, this sense of excitement. It was like this, like this movement was happening, and like, oh shit, like these guys are all like, and girls were all like contributing code, and like, the notion of open source was totally foreign
Yeah.
to me, and it was just like an excitement. And like I started like trying to write some device drivers and stuff, and kind of like, I met some other people who were doing a similar thing, and like we collaborated on stuff, and it kind of all fell apart eventually. But yeah, for me, all those three things were kind of happening at once.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I remember, so my first introduction to Linux, like I was in college, like, and you go through a computer science curriculum, and like you find out that like every professor
Yeah.
was like a Linux nerd, right? And
Uh,
like one of my
uh-huh.
professors like worked on the FreeBSD project, and
Yeah.
all this crazy stuff. And I just remember having a conversation with one of them, and I just kind of asked, why not Windows? And they just look at you with like absolute disgust, where it's like, why would I pay for an operating system, right?
Uh-huh.
And
Right.
and it's funny because now you think about like Windows and its relationship with Linux, like with WSL and a lot of their Microsoft
Yeah.
products run in
Totally
Linux,
different.
right? It's funny how things kind of come 360, right? Everybody
Yeah.
remembers like Linux is a cancer, that conversation, right? And now
Uh-huh.
we're in this
Uh-huh.
point where it's like, oh yeah, you can get Windows and you can get Linux inside of it, and everything runs
Yeah.
perfectly. And so,
Yeah,
I think,
yeah. Oh, and I'm on the opposite side too. Like
yeah,
now, I produce a bunch of open source, and I'm like, I think you should pay for this, and I do a lot
yeah.
of work to make it so that the companies who are using our open source have to pay for it.
Well,
So
yes, that's an
yeah.
interesting question to even have like a conversation about, right? Because I think that model, I think, is very well known and successful in a lot of cases, right? Like where you have like a very strong open source community around an open source product which has a license that is somewhat flexible as it pertains to who uses it. But then there's a point in time where it's like, okay, users are no longer using it, organizations and companies are using it. And,
Yeah,
let's be real, if you make $100 million with a product that uses open source software, it might make sense to have to pay a little bit for something of that,
yeah,
right? So like I'd like to kind
yeah,
of with you about, that what does that transition look like? And how do you like properly talk to your user base? Like, hey,
yeah.
if you're using this for your open source or your personal projects, you're totally fine. But like if you work for an organization that's using it, we need to have a conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, I've got 30 minutes of content
Let's
on this
go.
because this
Let's
has been
go.
a lot of my life for the past couple of years. Okay, so I have to do this. I kind of have to explain. I have to explain a couple things. So first, I mentioned we make this open source project called Linkerd. It is a service mesh. If you're in Kubernetes, if you're in the Kubernetes ecosystem, you've probably heard of it. At least heard of it. Maybe you've used it. If you're not in the Kubernetes ecosystem, then like probably none of those words or terms make any
Sure.
sense to you. It's essentially a networking layer that kind of sits on top of Kubernetes, a layer of abstraction above kind of what I'll call
Yeah,
traditional
bare code.
networking,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is right, which is like, hey, how do we establish like an IP or a TCP connection from point A to point B? So what Linkerd does is it basically gives you HTTP and gRPC semantics at the platform level. So we'll do things like load balancing, but we'll do them at the request level. We do things, circuit breaking and timeouts and retries, and or have done anything with like distributed systems. You'll recognize a lot of those words and a
Yeah.
lot of those tools as things you use to like reduce failure and prevent cascading failure in distributed systems. We do a lot of stuff with like TLSing the connection, so it gets encrypted, in transit, and authentication and authorization. Basically, it's a whole set of tools that you use, on top of Kubernetes when you're building like a platform. And so the reason why I emphasize that is because the users of Linkerd, and the users of most of the projects in this kind of Kubernetes space are actually quite distinct. There's many different types of open source.
Sure.
These are, there's like, just to give an example, well, there's Linux itself, right, which has like the BDFL, and has like a huge contributor base. But that originally was like a nights and weekends thing, right? This was like we were doing this out of the love of our hearts,
Yeah.
and you still see that pattern in things like Ruby and Python and some of the languages. You've got this BDFL and you've got this like passionate contributor base. Um, but it's kind of the opposite in the Kubernetes space. Everyone in this space is there because their company is paying them to be there, to evaluate these projects, to run them in their company's ecosystems that the company can like build a business on top of them, right? And so we, for a long time with Linkerd, we kind of closed our eyes to that and we were like, we're just going to make an amazing open source project. We're going to be no holds barred. We're going to get every possible feature and everything. And like at some point, something awesome is going to happen, right? At some point, we'll figure out how to make money. At some point, the universe will reward us for
Sure.
like
Yeah, of
all of
course.
this incredible software because we're solving major problems, and that was kind of our attitude. And then what happened was, what you might expect if you're on the cynical side instead of the optimistic side, is that like no one ever wanted to pay us anything. And even if they wanted to, because some of them, some of our users were like, oh yeah, I would love to figure out a way, maybe we could do a support contract. Their management would be like, no, why the hell would we pay
Yeah.
anything to anyone? Like this thing works, and it works amazingly,
Yeah.
right? And and the thing that really, kind of drove me crazy was that the wisdom at the time was, hey, you're getting great enterprise traction, that's amazing. What you have to do is sell support contracts. Like every enterprise is going to buy one
Yeah.
because like it's insurance for them. And in fact, what we found was that we did get people buying these support contracts, but after a year or two, and by people I mean companies, after a year or two they were like, actually this thing works really
Yeah.
well all the time, and like we don't need this. Oh, and now we kind of have like a budget crunch, we're feeling tight, so we're just going to cancel that. And I realized that the better we made this project, the better we made Linkerd, the more reliable and like fail safe that we made it, the harder it was to sell these
You
support
coded
contracts. And if we
yourself
had
out of
made it really
business.
crappy,
Yeah.
then like we'd be making
Yeah.
tons of money from
Yeah.
support. And that's when I became radicalized.
Ra- ra-
And then
radicalized. Um, you want to
and
finish
then we
that?
did
Yeah. Yeah.
something, then we did the next step, which,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, so let's take a pause on that because I
yeah,
think,
yeah.
as somebody that is a consumer of open source, I haven't built anything to the scale of Linkerd. Obviously, I don't think very many people have, but I think that there's one thing that is very consistent in open source. You have people that over what's the best way to phrase this? They assume that the people that are building it are doing it for the love of everything, and they are basically commodities, right? Like the idea of the open source as a commodity is always something that's been very fascinating to me. And I think of it like this: if you are a group of individuals that are building something that are being used by lots of people, there's a few ways that you can get return on your investment, right? You can do the support thing like you're talking about. Hey, we have this large project. If it doesn't work for you, pay us and we'll help you, right? The second is like the freemium model where it's like, okay, you like this very very small version of what's capable. Here's some more capabilities, but you got to pay for it. And then there's the third, which I think I'm seeing a lot more. It's like, okay, if you have revenue to a certain amount, you have to start paying us because
Mhm.
obviously it's showing that our tools or what we're building, our project is essential to how you make money. And I'm curious to know, like, obviously you kind of hinted at like the support one kind of goes away as you engineer a good product, right? But I like to talk about the other two where it's like, the freemium approach, which I think is totally fair, and then kind of like the, hey, you make money off of us, you should pay us too.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot to pick apart there. That second one, like, part of both of them, actually both of those things you describe are not necessarily incompatible, right? Like that
Sure.
second thing
Yeah.
is just like, where's the threshold? But the open source licenses, obviously there's like a big debate that I really don't want to get to around like what does it mean to be open source. But by and large, they don't permit you to do that kind of thing directly, right? They don't permit you to say, hey, this is Apache v2, except if you are
Yeah.
making more than $50 million a year, then like you need to pay us, right? Then you can write whatever you license you want, but now you have like this custom license that has is not open source, I think,
Yeah.
by anyone's definition. So the only way you can really do that sort of thing is by having two versions. You have like the open source version, and then you have the
Yeah.
non-open source version. And the this works, and it worked for us, and I'll explain what we did. It worked quite well for us, but where that model starts to fall down, where a lot of this falls down, is for library authors. For something that's a product like Linkerd, where like, you are our audience, the people who use Linkerd, they're not necessarily devs. They're SREs, they're operators, they're platform engineers. They like install this thing on the cluster, and mostly they want it to like, solve these problems and then to never break, right?
Set and
And then
forget. Yeah.
they want to be able to, yeah, exactly. They want to be able to never have to think about it, right? And once they solve the problems, they want to move on to like the next 100 problems they have. So for that type of thing, you basically you're almost building a product. Well, you are building a
Yeah.
product, right? And so in that world, yeah, you can say I'm going to have the kind of core open source stuff over here, and then I'm going to have these expensive, paid only features in this like different version or this distribution over there. And then the trick is like, you need to find, and you're right, that's a very common pattern. I actually think it works well. It's the one that we adopted because I couldn't think of anything better. The trick is, of course, it's, the devil's in the details. So the trick is you have to, the features that you're monetizing have got to be things that you need when you're a big
Yeah.
company,
Yeah.
but that you don't need when you're
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
And if you can do that, then the rest of like how you write the license and who's allowed to do what for the commercial version, that's kind of like fine details. But if you don't have that feature distinction right, then you're always playing this game of like, okay, well now I've got stuff in the enterprise version, but the community is like writing a PR to
Yeah.
re-implement it, and then what am I going to do? Am I going to, no, I don't accept
Yeah.
that? Well, that looks really shitty. Are you going to say yes, but I'm going to kind of let you? I'm not going to help you. Like you
Yeah.
just have you have this misalignment of incentives. So you have to like have a really clear delineation of those features. So yeah, that's essentially what we
Yeah.
did. And the other thing that we did, and this was quite controversial at the time. And I spent, this was about 2 years ago. I spent a good couple months getting beat up on the internet like hardcore about this. Is we stopped making open stable releases of Linkerd.
Mm.
So we said we're going to build these. We call them edge releases. They're basically weekly
Yeah.
releases in open source. Every week we're going to cut a new release. It's kind of the latest bug fixes, latest security changes, whatever. But like we're just going to keep rolling forward, and you're welcome to use those things, and
Yeah.
we'll make them as production ready, as we can, and we kind of like add other stuff on top of that. Like we'll do retrospectives, reviews, and we'll say, oh, this one we actually don't recommend, and this one we do, and so we try and make them, actual consumable projects. But what we don't do is we're not backporting bug
Yeah.
fixes, we're not doing semantic versioning. That stuff you got to pay for.
Yeah.
And that change, which is, by the way, is like totally allowed,
Sure.
by all the
Allowed, right?
licenses.
Allowed depending on
Yeah,
who
yeah,
you
yeah,
ask,
right,
right?
right. Like
Exactly.
it's not a violation
Yeah.
of Apache v2 or whatever. But that was quite a controversial change. Now, but but I will say, before we made this change, kind of pulling out stable releases and making them part of the commercial product, um, we were on the verge of like dying,
Sure.
and Linkerd was going to go away forever. And after we made that change, within about 8 months, we had become profitable,
Yeah.
and we were able to hire more maintainers, and we were able to fund the project in perpetuity. And and I'm very proud of that. And I think one of the big differences between kind of the situation I'm describing and like the good old Linux of yore. I mean, obviously Linux is around now, but there's like,
Yeah.
it's a lot of corporate involvement. The olden day Linux, when it was like all nights and weekends, one of the big differences is that, boy, I had an incredible point to make. Oh, is that all the maintainers for these projects are paid. Like we
Yeah.
don't want nights and weekends maintainers, not really for Linkerd, right? Like if you're relying on this thing, and the way that Linkerd sits in your Kubernetes platform, we're like a pacemaker. We're
Hmm.
like in the beating heart of your application, and like mediating the communication between the services on there. Like that thing it can't be like a volunteer led effort. This has
Yeah.
to be like a paid professional grade product. And so the only way that I could do that was by paying the maintainers full time. And the only way I could pay the maintainers full time was if I had an economic engine that could power this project. And the only way that that economic engine would be like aligned with keeping maintainers and keeping the project healthy was if I could actually sell the project
Yeah.
in some form, right? It had to be a very direct relationship. The better we make this thing, the more money we make, the more money we can put back into it. And so we were able to do that, but it was
Yeah.
quite a
Well,
jumping off the
sure.
cliff.
And I think for one, I think a lot of people that are reasonable accept that. I think that
Well,
like there
that's
are.
a big caveat there.
Sure. Yeah, of course, right? But I think that there's a few things that I think open source projects they do that quote unquote like irritate their user base, right? You can change the licensing. Like I worked at a company
Yeah,
that changed their licensing for something and it became a whole thing. Um,
yeah,
you could, kind of do what you're doing where it's like, the rolling updates, which I think is a great approach because you're still showing that you're providing some level of support, right? But you're not committing to like an LTS or
right,
stable
right,
release or whatever, because I think that at
right.
the end of the day, you want people, if they're outside of the hobbyist world, you want them to come to the commercial platform, right? Like reasonably, right? Um, but I
Yeah,
do think it's very interesting, like this conversation between open source and like what a lot of people call open code, where it's like the code is there, but you really can't use it like via like the most acceptive licenses ever, right? We don't need to get into licenses, but I'm generally curious as to your thoughts is like when you think about open source and you think about transitioning all the way from an open source project to something gets accepted as a CNCF project, right? And all of the maturation that goes into that. Like you're going to upset people as a part of that process. So how do you handle the, I guess, calming of the masses when you make changes that could potentially cause some upset?
yeah, yeah. No, and that's a great question, and I'll tell you what I did. But like, I think the if we had kind of thought this through a couple of years earlier and started building on this and made it more gradual change, it actually would not have been that controversial. The thing that caused people anguish, which I totally understand, is like we changed something that they were used to getting, right? We
Yeah.
changed something that they were, it's like, and it's, and I'm going to use like a service related analogy. We were delivering a box of farm fresh vegetables to your front door every week. And like, for years we were doing that. And you had built your whole kind of household budget around that and
Yeah.
your meal plans. And then at some point we were like, Isaac, I'm sorry, but like we can't do this now. You got to pay for it. And you'd be like, the hell? Like I built my
Yeah.
whole life around this thing.
Yeah.
You would get upset. And so I get it. Like I totally get it. And so, you know, what I did was just tell them the truth and just be really upfront about it and be like, look, everyone who works on this project is paid. I sign their paychecks. Like that money has to come from
Sure.
somewhere. And it's not happening right now. The only way I can make this happen is if I can sell this product. And, that didn't help. A lot of people in open source kind of view the money side of this as like a toxic,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you are even talking about that, you're not pure of heart, you're like not really, this is supposed to be a community effort. And I'll say, by and large, I'm very, I think there's many good things that come out of the CNCF kind of community, but there is a big element of that, like, oh, we are actually, we're a community and like we're all this together and lovey-dovey. And in reality, like every person is there because they're getting paid to be there. And so it's a little hypocritical, I found for some of these people to be raising such a big fuss when I'm like, the only reason you're here is because your employer is paying you to be here, and you have no problem with that aspect of receiving money, but you have a problem with like the Linkerd maintainers receiving money. Like I don't know how to describe it. So I guess that's a long answer to a short conversation, but I do think, or a short question, but I do think the key of it is you got to be upfront about what you're doing. You have to say like, look, this is how this project works, and like for this to happen, like the money has to come from somewhere, and it's actually in your best interest. It's in your best interest. If you want this project, if you're using this project, it's in your best interest for there to be this economic engine that's running behind it, that's powering it, and that's making money. When it makes this project better, it makes more money.
Yeah.
That's like you want that to happen.
I mean, I think that's more than fair. And as somebody that like, look, let's be real. I built the thing so I could do whatever I want. Let's be real. Like as
Right.
you know,
Right.
so but I do think that you do hold like um some level of relationship with the people that use it, and you don't want to upset them because you're a nice guy,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And I
Right.
think, you know,
Right.
one of the things that I've always been very fascinated by with like open source and the new open source movement, especially around like you're talking about the CNCF, and it's like how a very large organization, like one of the biggest tech companies in the world, has employees who their sole job it is to work on CNCF projects or large open source projects, which I think is great. However, there becomes a rift because then you have contributors who are kind of doing things on behalf of their employer, and they might not agree with the whole architecture not the right word, the whole ecosystem that goes around a project, right? So like how do you manage that? Because you know you have people that are core to the project that have kind of been like your nights and weekends folks that you're talking about. You have random drive-by contributions, like somebody's like, oh, like I want to create this thing that does this
Mhm.
thing, and here's a pull
Yeah.
request. And then you have the
Yeah.
third, which is like, oh, we're a team of like 3 engineers that work at, you know, large tech company. This is our
Yeah.
pull request to do this thing. Like, how do you manage those different levels of contribution?
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely gets tricky, especially since making the PR is one thing, but then it's like, who's on the hook for maintaining this thing?
Yeah,
Like, what if someone finds a bug, or like if we're like, oh, actually, it's conflicting with this other thing over here, and like we need to get more involved. I don't know that there's a great answer there. I think the best that we've come up with so far in Linkerd is we just try and be as we're not above setting a pretty high bar for contributions, and we try and be as upfront about it as like, hey, in order for us to merge this, you have to meet these
sure.
standards, and like those we define those standards. Like this thing has to be we you're contributing this, that's nice, but you're going to vanish, and then we're going to be on the hook for like maintaining this. Or you're telling, you're contributing this, you got this team of three, that's great. You got to, that's amazing that you get to work on this. But like next year, your company might make a different decision
Yeah,
and you might vanish, right? At the end of the day, we're left, everyone's adding vegetables to the soup, and like we're left trying to like drink the soup. I don't know what's the analogy is going.
that works.
So
No, 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 no.
so you just got to set those standards high and be like, and you got to be willing to say no. Like that's a great contribution, but like I just don't think we can merge that in. And thank you,
Sure,
but like we can't take it on. I've heard of at least one project that just turned off, open got contributions entirely. They're
sure.
like, you know what, contributions from the outside world is actually a maintenance nightmare, and we're just going to build a map. And if you want to interact with us, don't send us code. Like, tell us what you want on the roadmap.
Yeah.
We haven't taken that approach, but I was like, yeah, I kind of understand that too.
Oh, for sure. And I think to your analogy, it's like when you're caught like holding the bag, right? Like when it's like, hey, at the end of the day, I got to go in there and I got to make some changes if, you know, we're trying to add this new feature and we
Right.
can't because it's breaking some test that's runs
Yeah.
because somebody added this thing over here and we don't know what it is. And yeah,
Yeah.
like things have gotten a bit easier as it pertains to like with AI and agentic work where it says, okay, well this is what this particular chunk of code is actually doing, and it can do, you know, some contextual stuff around your entire code base and all that. But you know, at the end of the day, like William, you got to look at the code, or like William in quotes.
Yeah.
A human
Right.
being needs to
Right.
actually figure out what's going on.
Right. Right.
Uh,
Right.
I'd like to kind of maybe go in reverse a little bit. You know, obviously you've spent a ton of your career like in this space, right? The idea that hey, we have disparate systems that might not have the most resiliency. The communication between them can be challenging. Code base is too big. Like, and we need some solution to fix. Like, when did you realize like you had an interest in that? Because I mean, we were talking about this before we got started. Like, unless you've actually dealt with the problem, you don't actually
Yeah.
understand the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, the stuff was all very new to me until around 2010. I started working at this tiny company called Twitter.
Mm,
Actually, it wasn't tiny. It was that tiny because I'd worked at a bunch of much smaller startups. So
sure.
there were like 200 people at the time. And they're like, oh, we're a startup. And I'm like, oh, if you're a startup, 200 people. But when I started at Twitter, it was during the heyday of like the fail whale. days,
Yeah.
written on this monolithic Ruby and Rails code base. And I loved Ruby. I was a big Ruby fan, still am. But they were having a lot of trouble scaling to the point where like the fail whale became this cultural phenomenon, and people were having like fail whale parties and stuff. And wow, you really have like, you've hit on product market fit when like when your product fails, people are still like, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, and so, over the course of 2010 to 2014, when I left, what Twitter did was they basically broke that thing down into what we would now call microservices, or maybe just services. They containerized a bunch of stuff. They didn't have Docker, but they used C groups and the JVM to do that. They ran it on this orchestrated platform. Didn't have Kubernetes at the time, but we had Mesos. Mesos was like a grad student project, but Twitter like productionized it. And not only did they encounter all sorts of like crazy distributed systems problems and had to solve them, but uh, it actually worked. Like at the end of that, the fail whale was kind of like, I don't want to say killed. It was released to swim off out into the ocean. And so that was my kind of big introduction, trial by fire kind of introduction to the world of um, uh, distributed systems problems, orchestration, containerization, kind of like this modern way to build software, at least arguably the modern way to build software. And when we started Buoyant, so I left Twitter to start Buoyant with another colleague from Twitter, and like our original idea was to take there was kind of like this library called Finagle that managed the communication between these services and handled a lot of those distributed systems problems. And our idea was basically to take that, but it was like a Scala
Sure.
library. Like
Yeah, yeah.
like it's only useful to you if like you really want to do if you're at the intersection of like distributed systems problems and like Scala functional programming, and like that, that
It's quite
intersection is
small.
very
It's
small.
quite a
We
small
just
window,
build it up
yeah.
as a yeah, exactly. So we said, well, you know what? Let's throw away the programming side of this. Let's turn this thing into a proxy. And that was kind of the core, insight of Linkerd, at least at that point, was, hey, once you have proxies, then like you can kind of insert them at the platform layer rather than at the application layer. And then the developers don't really have to think too much about this, which is what you want, right? You want the devs to be like building business logic. And then the platform team can tackle those. And yeah, so that was my introduction to that class of problem.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating, the whole like the Kubernetes hype cycle, right? Because I think, I think you mentioned it to an extent, and we talked about this before we got started. It's like, if you worked at a company that was big enough to have this problem, you had to build the solution yourself, right? And then
Yeah,
Kubernetes are the predecessor to Kubernetes, and then Kubernetes itself comes out, and then everybody's like, okay, we're all going to kind of, I guess, attach ourselves because this is the approach. Like, there's no other opinions. Like, this is the opinion, right?
yeah,
Um, and I left it because there was obviously other orchestrators that came out at that time. Docker Swarm was a thing,
yeah, yeah,
and we have this situation now where when people think of distributed systems or quote unquote cloud native, they think of Kubernetes, right?
yeah,
And to an extent, like, and I'll just say this, like, quite frankly to you, like if you're building out like a quote unquote production grade Kubernetes cluster, like there are a few things that you add on top of it. Like you add Linkerd, you add
yeah,
some other things,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
I'd love to get your thoughts. As obviously, I'd love to hear the story about how that attachment started. But like I'd imagine at some point in time you realize like, oh, like we're kind of the de facto thing for this thing.
Yeah, well,
I'm
I don't know if we
oversimplifying it
ever thought we were the
obviously, but like yeah.
de facto thing, but yeah, we certainly we got a ton. So the story of Linkerd is, like I just
Yeah.
described, we kind of stood with this kind of coming from Twitter. Kubernetes was, maybe a twinkle in Joe Beta's eye, or whatever at that point. But and the first version of Linkerd was actually, totally agnostic. You could talk to. Well, no, I guess Kubernetes was starting, was just starting to get traction, but Mesos was way bigger and Docker Swarm was way bigger, and so we had, we kind of made it, abstract across all those things. You could plug it into whatever. And then, for a variety of reasons, one of them being like the JVM is just like so big. Like,
Understatement.
the
Very.
term scales
Yeah. Yeah.
great at scaling up, but not so great at
Sure.
scaling down. We kept running in the situation where we were like, hey, use Linkerd. It's like this super lightweight little proxy. You add it, and like takes care of all the stuff. And they'd be like, well, how big is it? And we'd say, oh, it's 150 megs. Like, we've really compressed it. And they'd be like, well, my Go service is 50 megs. So like,
Yeah.
why would I
Yeah.
quadruple its size? So we ended up rewriting it in Rust.
Sure.
For the proxy component, and in Go for the control plane component. And as part of that, this is now 2018, so maybe 3 years into it, we targeted Kubernetes because in that 3 year exclusively, because in that 3 year period, like Kubernetes had just
Yeah.
shot to
Yeah.
the kind of like the obvious destination. And why did that happen? Like, I some of it was luck, I think.
Oh, sure.
Some of it, Kubernetes is, in my opinion, Kubernetes is very well designed, and there's lots that I like about it. But I think a big part of its popularity was the fact that it came from Google at a time where that community was like, oh, Google is like
Hmm.
awesome.
Sure.
Oh, Google is the right way to do this, and they got a lot of credibility, from that. And in the early days, there were so many knocks on Kubernetes, couldn't scale more than 1,000 nodes or 100 nodes or something. And Mesos, meanwhile, was like, oh yeah, we can run in production on tens of thousands of nodes. But something around the design and the community, and also I think the just the appetite for new stuff, the kind of like neophile, thread that you still find today in that community, just gave it a ton of traction. So much so that, yeah, by the time 2018 rolled around, we were like, all right, we're just targeting this thing. And
Yeah.
like, Twitter didn't use Kubernetes. It wasn't even around,
Yeah.
but we were like, well, okay, I we don't I don't I maybe have an opinion, but like I'm not gonna fight the inevitable
Oh, sure.
at this point.
Well, yeah, and I think it is okay if the I guess the masses attach to something, and that's the thing, good, bad, or indifferent. And Kubernetes is, you know, good, bad, or indifferent. It is the de facto standard. Like if there was a company today that was like, we're going to make a competitor with Kubernetes, like they would immediately be told, no, thank you, right? And I
Yeah,
think,
unless there was something like, a clear
yeah,
different, like there's some reason why,
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
But one of the things that I do think was done right about Kubernetes, and maybe not quite so right in Mesos, was it was very explicitly set up as kind of like a Lego base plate. It was
yeah,
like, hey, we're gonna do this and no more. And like, here's like our kind of like boundaries, and we want you to build on top of this, and we
yeah,
want you to have projects. So you mentioned that everyone runs Kubernetes with other projects. That's almost by, I
by
think that is
design.
by
Yeah,
design. Like,
yeah,
you have to figure out what you're doing for CI/CD, and you have to figure out what you're doing for a service mesh, and you have to figure out what you're doing for, we're I don't know what else you do on Kubernetes.
yeah.
Like, there are these, certificate management, like there are these building blocks that you just have to do when you're assembling a fully functional platform.
Yeah, you mentioned something a bit earlier too, which I think, specifically around, this area that you're in, like the cloud native space, Kubernetes and Linkerd and other sort of things, is that it kind of created like a new segment of tech, right? Like, and I think of, and I equate
Mhm.
it similar to like with DevOps, right? When DevOps got really, really big about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, and every like we went from like there being ops people whose job it was to basically get the code to the server, and now you had DevOps engineers who basically built pipelines, right?
Yeah.
And I think about the same sort of thing happening in the Kubernetes world where we have operators whose job it was like fix the issue in production. And those people that turned into a real job. Like an SRE is like a real job now, right? Not to
Yeah.
say that it wasn't a
Yeah.
real job in the past, but like you can go and search, SRE jobs in, Austin,
Yeah.
Texas, and it'll come up, right?
Yeah.
Um, I'd love to get your thoughts about that, like, because for the most part, you mentioned a bit earlier, like SREs are some of the main customers for your product. So, like,
Mhm.
and they're a very specific skill set, right? Like, they're not engineers; they don't write code every day, but they can if they want to. And they're not
Yeah.
operators, not system administrators, but if they want to, they want to. So, how do you like conversate with that sort of role that's so hybrid?
Yeah, so the pattern that we saw emerging as a result of this is what I will call very generally like the rise of the the platform as like a
Yeah.
first class object, and like, in the olden days, as you alluded to, like you'd have the developers and you'd be like, all right, I wrote the code, it compiles, now I hand it to ops, and ops like does everything else, and I go home, and like the kind of the value of DevOps was it basically said, hey, if you wrote that code, you actually need to be on call for it
Yeah.
too. It's not like there's no one else around who, and there aren't people who are working on automation and whatever, but like you as a developer, you're on the hook for that code that you run. You can't hand that problem off. And I think that was very, very valuable. And then combined with Kubernetes, well, now you have like, hey, we have a team, and we saw this like the companies that were really successful with Kubernetes, especially early on, were the ones that really made this explicit. Hey, we have a team that is building the platform, and that sometimes that's just SRE. Sometimes in bigger companies it'll sub-specialize. You'll have like there's a dedicated platform team that's like different from SRE, but like it's kind of the same bigger bucket. And then we have and our internal customers are the developers, and our job as a platform team is basically to make sure that the developers can, well, it's two things. Number one, make sure the developers are happy, like they can ship what they
Yeah.
need to, and they don't feel like they're getting friction from the platform and like things are breaking. And then number two, we need to make sure the platform is always reliable and secure. If either of those things are not true, then like your platform, team is not doing a good job. But I think that distinction really helped unlock, a lot of progress and a lot of speed and evolution, because then the developers really could be focused on, I'm writing the business logic that powers the business, and also if I write a bug, like I'm still going to be expected to
Yeah.
fix it. Like if this thing breaks at 3 a.m, I'm still going to have to wake up and then deal with it. But the operational concerns around like, okay, well, how many replicas, and like, is it in this data center or that one, this cluster or that one, is it like, does it need a lot of memory or little memory? Like a lot of that I can hand off to another team,
Yeah.
and that, they are two distinct domains of expertise. So yeah, that's what we saw work pretty well.
Yeah.
And yeah, did Kubernetes create that single-handedly? No, I don't think so, but it kind of like fit into that
Sure.
model.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was trying to say as well, where it's like I guess the goals of the industry based on the needs of the industry changed to the point where certain segments needed to get lit up and disciplines need to be created for them, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
I think too what's fascinating is that now you think about this space that we're in tech, right? Where, everything is about agents and everything is about figuring out how to effectively, abstract a lot of the toil that comes with like people like working in tech. Like we were joking earlier, I was saying it's like how some, I think that in tech you have to be a bit of a masochist, right? Where, you're dealing with so much pain constantly. Um, and now, like, we're creating tools that single-handedly are trying to eliminate that pain, and in the process of doing that, starting to eliminate some of the work that, an
Yeah,
operator
yeah,
or an SRE person or an engineer would typically do.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
from your
yeah.
perspective, like, you run a very, very successful open source project. You have a business that's built on top of that open source project that is well adopted and, like you said, profitable. And the tech landscape is changing to the effect that it's like, okay, maybe we don't need as many SREs anymore because we can have an agent that is trained on all of the best patterns and practices around SRE work, right? I'd love to get your thoughts is like, how do you go about managing a product and a business when this landscape is changing so much?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
That's
uh,
the $1 million question,
gosh,
right? Right?
it's like it's exactly what the board is asking me. I'm like, I
Well,
don't know, guys.
maybe they'll
No,
watch. Maybe they'll watch the
it's
podcast. Maybe that's great. Then,
right. Yeah, listen to my podcast, and then I'll talk. And the answer is, and then I'll just like
yeah, and then no,
quit.
just disconnect. Disconnect exactly.
um, it's funny because there have been like these super hyped technology things in the past where
Sure.
I've been able to just ignore them. I'd be like, I don't think that's real. I don't think that's going to go. NFTs.
We
I
talked
was
about this
like,
before we got started. Yeah, blockchain,
what?
Web3.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah, the blockchain. I'm like, I guess that's still, I guess people are still doing that and building businesses, but largely I've been able to ignore it. With AI, I can't ignore it. If nothing else, because our users and our customers are like under intense pressure to, if nothing else, to figure out what it means for them.
Sure.
They're like, "Ah, like, we're," and we can't just ignore that for them. We kind of have to be there for that. So, what's changing? I'll tell you my opinions so far. Like, I've been, I and most of Buoyant use these tools pretty heavily.
Sure.
I don't think you can really I don't think you can say I'm not going to do that. I don't think there's value to saying, you know what, I'm only going to write handcrafted code. I'm only going to run these Kubernetes commands by hand. Like, no one places value on that. Like, you have to. Here's a brand new super powerful tool, and like, you got to learn it or you're going to be left behind. Here's the steam shovel, and like, you got to learn how to use it or
Yeah.
you're going to be left behind, digging things by hand. And like, the market for that is very, very niche. um the way I think about it is, so far everything I've seen has basically allowed you to operate at a higher level abstraction. Like, at the end of the day, someone still needs to understand, like, what are we doing? Like, what's the goal,
Yeah.
and what's the architecture, and how are we, like, what's the point? Like, you know, and I think that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. Like, we are a a everything we do is in service of, okay, I'll take a very mercenary approach. Everything that we do is in service of finding more customers.
Of
Those
course.
customers are humans.
That's how
Now
capitalism
maybe that
works,
changes
right?
one day.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that changes one day. Maybe one day, like, we have our AI salespeople selling to AI customers, and like, it's all agentic, and then like, I'll have to reevaluate this. But for now, there is a human being at the end of this, and our job is, whether it's, kind of from the open source perspective or from the corporate perspective, our job is to solve problems for them, tangible problems, in a way that like makes their lives so much easier that they want to part with some of their hard-earned, budget. And that's a human being, and like, you have to talk to them in human terms, and you have to solve problems that human beings have. And so everything that I've seen from the tooling and all the agentic workloads and stuff, which again we use quite heavily, it's all allowed us to operate at a higher level of abstraction. It has allowed us to be kind of shockingly more efficient. But it hasn't allowed us to like replace SREs. It
Sure.
hasn't allowed us to be like, you know what, we don't need you anymore because we've got a script. Like, someone's got to write that, or whatever. We have an agent now. Someone's got to like figure out what that agent's doing and like update it and tell it to do new stuff. And so I think there's big open questions around, what's the role of a junior person? Like,
Yeah.
what's the role of someone coming into this industry? I think there's answers, but they're less clear. But certainly for senior people, everything that I've seen is like, if this allows me to do something 10 times faster, well, then I want the whole company being 10 times faster. I don't want the 1x speed, and I don't want to divide the company into a tenth, decimate the company,
Sure.
and have the same speed. I want the same size company going 10 times faster.
Yeah, I heard it. So, somebody that I really respect in tech made a comment last week where they said, we what we need to acknowledge is everything before Opus doesn't matter. He made a comment about
Mm,
like the Opus model, right? And how, obviously people talk about how great it is for writing code and all
yeah.
these sort of things, right? And they made a point of saying that we can no longer talk about how long it takes to build as a part of roadmap. And when that was said, as we build products, all we care about is roadmap. How long does it take for this, particular
Right.
feature to get built? Now the answer is, well, how good is the prompt and how good do we iterate with more prompts, right? So
Mm,
like, as somebody that like, look, you have a product. Like, how tempted are you to just, oh, we have all of these things that have been in the backlog that we just want to get out there, like, and just bring immense
yeah.
value to end users. But then, we talked about this at the being at the start, is like, you're kind of would engineer yourself out of potential things because you're like, the product is so good that people aren't maybe keeping it for longer, or maybe you're not finding new customers or whatever the issue is, right? Like, how do you manage that? Or it's like, like you could probably in the span of a month do all of the things that you want to do in Linkerd. You probably could, right?
All the things, maybe not,
Sure,
but many of
obviously
them.
gross over exaggeration, but I think you
Yeah,
get my point, right?
yeah. Yeah. No, the scale of things has changed, but despite that, kind of the core, and some of this is a little bit specific to Linkerd. Like the code that goes into Linkerd cannot be YOLO'd. It's not like
Sure.
vibe codable code. It's like, yeah, the agent can write a bunch of stuff, but at the end of the day, like we have to all feel confident that this thing, that this pacemaker we're placing into the patient's heart is going to work. And like, how do we develop that confidence? It's there's a certain amount of human attention that has to happen there regardless. So yeah, the scale of things has changed. Um, Gosh, I had an incredible point to make that now I can't
It'll come back to you.
I can't remember because I've been using AI too much and it's drained my brain.
Uh,
Um,
I do think that, sin
I
go
remember
ahead,
what it
go ahead.
is. Okay, this is my moment of genius. Um, the core problems are still the
Yep,
same, despite the change in scale, right? Like ultimately, regardless of how that code is getting into the platform, regardless of what's running on there, you still need the platform to be reliable. You still need it to be secure. You still need it to be, low friction to the developers. You still need it to be fast. And like none of that has changed at all.
yeah.
So you still have that core problem statement. And even if you're moving at 10x the speed, nothing about that has changed. So we still have to solve that for our customers and for our users.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this, more in the last few months than I think I've ever heard my entire career in tech, where, you know, the code was never the thing. Like, writing code was never the thing. It was always solving the problem was the thing. And it's funny
Right.
because,
Right.
as technologists, we're very guilty of like, give me the tool to fix
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
give me the
Yeah.
hammer for the nail or whatever, right? And we tend
Yeah.
to just deviate so far into the abstract of like meta stuff with tools and platforms
Yeah.
and frameworks that we just completely forget that it's like, oh, we're doing all of this to solve some problem.
Yeah,
And
we got so wrapped up in writing the code that like we
yeah,
forgot to ask ourselves the question of like, should we even be doing this?
yeah, and I'd like to kind of end on that, right? Where, you know, obviously you don't have a crystal ball. You can't figure out where this stuff is going to be in 5 years. I don't think anybody can. But I do want to ask you, in this world where systems are getting like the scale of systems is never going to shrink. I think that as we build software, it's kind of like the universe, it's always expanding, right? And the need for platforms, the need for tools like Linkerd is almost essential as it pertains to like building scalable systems. And, how do you see this tracking over time as, you're not just building applications, you're building frameworks and agents on top of these things as well that can also build applications and agent like it's very snake eating tail where you have things that are building things that are going to build something else, right? So my question is that very roundabout way. The question is what does the future look like for systems in general as they get more and more distributed?
Yeah, I mean, the the agentic and like the potential AGI like aspect of this is a thing that's really hard to model out. But at the end of the day, like software is going to run in the same way, right? At the end of the day, software is going to run on lots of different nodes. It's going to have distributed systems problems. It's going to be responsible for being secure and reliable. At the end of the day, something's going to power the traffic light, and something's going to power the ATC, and something's going to power the train. And those constraints haven't changed. So I'm actually quite optimistic. I feel like we've all been handed something that in some ways is akin to a chainsaw, and we've been using like a little chisel
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
most of our lives, and like, whoa, it's crazy, and like, watch out, don't accidentally cut off your leg. But if you use that thing the right way, gosh, you can accomplish a lot. And so it's scary because like the pace has suddenly really accelerated. but those core problems are still waiting to be solved.
That's, I mean, an optimistic outlook, I think, is very important in this time because I think that it's hard to see the forest through the trees. And once you recognize that you're in a forest, you just get it, right? And you learn to adapt to being in the forest. And I want to thank you so much, William, for this chat. It's been great to, get your thoughts about different pieces of technology and obviously, the cool things that you and folks are doing at Buoyant. Um, for folks that might want to be paying attention to what William and his team are doing, you can find him on Blue Sky. So at williammorgan.me. So WILLIMMORGAN.me. There'll also be some links to Buoyant's website and the Linkerd project as well, which I highly recommend you taking a look at. Um, Before we sign off, my friend, do you have any parting words?
Yeah, if you don't use Linkerd, then AI is going to take away your job. So
Sta-
quickly go buy
Stamp it down. Stamp it down.
it.
I mean,
No, thank you, Isaac. I really appreciate this conversation. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about all the fun things behind Linkerd and Buoyant and my own very boring life history. So just
there was nothing boring about it, my friend. Again, I
and
want to
yeah, let's check back in a year and see where AI is taking
Yeah,
us.
I mean, you'll have solved all the problems by then. And then, like you said, there'll
I'll,
be all the agents will be talking to each other and you'll be on the beach just like checking your bank account as it goes up, right?
I'll have my agentic system talk to your agentic system,
This
and
is very
then the
true.
two of us can. I don't
This
know if it's lying on the beach. It might be doing the dishes and and the vacuuming.
That's fair too. But again, William, I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been great having you on the show. And thank you for the folks that are watching live as well as listening in the future. So my name is Isaac Levin. This has been Coffee and Open Source. And if you like this episode, share it with your friends because I think more people should listen to this because I do it for fun and people should listen to it. Um, so I want to thank you. And for my friend William, I want to hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, sir. You too. Thanks for having me.